Professor Marandi, and we're lucky that the chair of American Studies at the University of Tehran is able to join us again this evening. Professor, welcome. Let's talk, if we may, first about what's happening in occupied Palestine. There seems to be a deliberate decision made by the new administration. Well, how can I put it? To kill large numbers of Palestinian civilians, whether they're sitting on roofs, whether they're leaning on a walking stick, whether they're boys or girls, men or women, fighters or not fighters. The number of people killed since January the 1st is shaping up to be a record outside of actual open wartime. What's going on there, do you think?
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. It's always a pleasure engaging with your audience as well. It is quite extraordinary, not just the fact that the new regime in Tel Aviv is killing increasingly large numbers of Palestinians, but it's amazing that Western media, legacy media, the mainstream media, they are even more quiet now than they were 15, 20 years ago. It's almost complete indifference, or it's justification. If you look at the BBC website, they not only distort the numbers of people who were murdered this year, but they try to represent or present or produce a narrative of what happened today that makes the Israelis look innocent, or at least less guilty. And Western human rights organizations more indifferent than before. It's quite amazing, but I think it's probably reflective of the fact that the new regime in Israel is more right-wing than before. It's always been an extremist, racist regime, but now it is more crude and open in its racism. Netanyahu is, in my opinion, a Trump-like figure, someone who has no ideology or belief, but will latch himself on to any movement that serves his purpose. And Netanyahu wants to stay out of jail, so the best thing for him to do is to join forces with the most extreme racists of the racist establishment in occupied Palestine. And I'd like to point out that, as you know, these demonstrators who are protesting against Netanyahu, it's not as if they are people who support Palestinian rights. They're, for the most part, themselves racists, but they are not as extreme as the right wing, and they're concerned about their own rights, and that's why they're on the streets. Of course, there is a segment of the Jewish society in Palestine that is completely opposed to apartheid, and they do some very good work. Some do very excellent work, but they are unfortunately a small minority in this broader framework.
Well, let's analyze some of those points that you made, Professor. First of all, we're told the annexation of Crimea, even though the people voted for union with Russia overwhelmingly back in 2014, the annexation of territory cannot be allowed to stand. But the annexation of East Jerusalem has been recognized by virtually all of the NATO governments, and many have moved their embassies to illegally annexed territory that was acquired by force. Ditto the annexation of the Golan Heights, which of course legally belongs to Syria, but which American presidents have gone and stood on and declared their acceptance of that illegal annexation. So some annexations are good and some annexations are bad. Ditto the unacceptability of acquiring other people's territory by force. We're told that that cannot stand. But my twin city of Nablus, where a massacre took place today, is indisputably territory that was acquired by force. It is indisputably, illegally, militarily occupied land. And yet, as you say, not a leader, not one leader has condemned what happened in Nablus today. I mean, the word Nablus today, I mean, the words double standards doesn't even approach. Double standards doesn't even approach this, does it? This, does it?
Yes, I agree completely. And it's not just governments, it's MPs, European parliamentarians have nothing to say. Maybe a handful of parliamentarians, or two to be more precise, may speak out, but everyone else is silent. No one is going to say anything about it. And there's also another difference, or an important difference, between what goes on in Palestine and what goes on in the Crimea or in the Donbass. And that is that the Russians, whether you agree with it or not, they've taken over territory that is Russian. The population in these areas in eastern and southern Ukraine are sympathetic to Russia. They want to be a part of Russia. Now, whether anyone accepts this or not, that's another issue altogether. But in the case of the Golan, in the case of the West Bank, in the case of East Jerusalem, the population is Palestinian. And European settlers are coming in to displace the Palestinians. And the Europeans and the Americans have no problem with that. Of course, for most of us, or at least for people like myself and most of my friends, the whole of Palestine is an illegitimate apartheid regime. And Palestinians who've been displaced have the right of return, and they should be allowed to live equally across Palestine. But even if we were to accept the the official European position about the two-state solution, and they know that there is no such thing, they know it is dead, they know it never existed. But even if they were, in order to kick the can down the road, we were to accept the European model, what is happening in these areas, as you point out, is much worse than what the Russians, by European standards, are doing in Ukraine. Because they are liberating their own people in their own eyes, but in Palestine, they are displacing the native population, and they're replacing them with immigrants from Europe.
Now, I mentioned earlier, Professor, the earthquakes which struck Syria, the sanctions which have bedeviled efforts to bring relief from the suffering there. But it didn't stop Israel beginning its bombardment of the Syrian capital again. What's that all about?
We have to remember when these air attacks began, and there were also artillery strikes in the past. During the dirty war in Syria, when NATO countries and their regional allies funded Al-Qaeda and their affiliates, and we have to keep in mind that ISIS was Al-Qaeda, it was Al-Qaeda, and they split. Jolani, the head of Al-Qaeda in Syria, was there on behalf of Abu Bakr Baghdadi. Then they split. ISIS was on one side, and they created ISIS, and then there was Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda, when they were fighting in Syria and affiliates, whenever they would start losing ground, the Israelis would bomb Syrian Arab army positions. And the same is true with ISIS. Alongside the Golan, which is occupied Syrian territory, but in any case, the Israelis assisted both ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It's extraordinary. They held the land between Israeli positions and Syrian army positions. Whenever the Syrian army tried to take back territory from ISIS or Al-Qaeda in that area, the Israelis would bomb the Syrians because they wanted to strengthen ISIS. They wanted to strengthen Al-Qaeda. And this is something that many Israeli regime officials and former officials and military officials admitted. They said openly that we prefer ISIS to Assad. So these air attacks began back then. Later on, in order to justify their airstrikes, they would say we're striking Iranian positions to sort of legitimize it, even though it doesn't create any legitimacy, because any Iranian forces in Syria are there at the behest of the Syrian government. So they're legitimate. If there are American forces in Germany and the German government allows it, then if a third party strikes those American bases, it's against the will of the German government. So, but in any case, they weren't really attacking, and they have not really been attacking Iranian soldiers. If an Iranian soldier was to be murdered by Israelis, it would be all over social media within a couple of hours. But over the past couple of years, we haven't had any such case where the Israelis intentionally hit an Iranian. What they do is they strike Syrian army positions and then try to claim that they were striking Iranians, as I said, to create this legitimacy, a sort of legitimacy in the eyes of their Western allies. But in this case, it is extraordinary that the country which is reeling from an earthquake, and at the same time it's suffering from sanctions and cannot bring in relief because of the sanctions, at that time, the Israeli regime chooses to bomb the people of Syria in the middle of the night. It is outrageous. And we've seen pictures of the victims, like the young woman who was murdered. None of these people are Iranian. All of these people are middle-class, educated people in Syria. No one in the West is going to condemn Israel. So if the Israeli regime kills people, murders, massacres people in Nablus, it's fine. If they massacre people in Syria, it's fine. The Israeli regime can do whatever it wants, and it can get away with it. The Western media will say nothing. Western government officials will say nothing. Western elites will say nothing. Western political parties will say nothing. It's just total silence. Yet somehow this is the free world. Somehow this is the civilized world. It's the garden. And the rest of us are supposedly the barbarians.
Finally, Professor, it's quite widely known, though not entirely acknowledged in Tehran, that Israel struck Iran and Iranian targets in Iraq, and the Iranian government promised that they would answer it, but they haven't answered it. Why is that?
There were two strikes. One was a convoy of goods that were going from Iraq to Syria. Those weren't owned, they didn't belong to Iran. They were Iraqi. 3 of the trucks that were full of food and goods for ordinary Syrians, they were aid for Syrians because of the sanctions. 3 of those trucks were destroyed. So the Israelis were impeding aid and assistance from getting to the Syrian people. In the case of Iran, we had 3 drones that were used to attack a military facility in Isfahan. That attack failed. One of the drones was downed. The other two got tangled in a net of electronic warfare, and the attack failed completely. Now, this is my personal interpretation. So this isn't, I'm just speaking on my own behalf. A week ago, we now know a drone struck an Israeli tanker, causing little damage. I would imagine that this could be possibly retaliation for Isfahan. Since the attack in Isfahan failed, whoever attacked the Israelis, they did not carry out much damage. They didn't inflict much damage because they just wanted to show the Israelis how vulnerable they are. And this is an important point. Because of the sanctions, very few Iranian ships sail through the Mediterranean. So therefore, the Israeli regime doesn't have all that many targets to strike. But because most of Israeli trade either goes into the Persian Gulf or near the Persian Gulf, or it goes past towards India, China, it goes past this area, a lot of Israeli trade is vulnerable to drones and missiles. So Iran is not very vulnerable. The Israelis are very vulnerable. And I think the people who hit the Israeli ship were sending a message to the Israelis that we can hurt you a lot more than you can hurt us. So back off.
Professor Marandi, as always, a pleasure talking to you and hearing your wisdom.